The Cornucopia by Cassie Carnage. In between the cracks and alleys, behind the darkened glass towers of the city, is a place that only exists in shadows. A place between and behind where men wander when they have absolutely nothing left to lose. It can be found in every city, just past the last blinking red light of the dead-end road, where the streets turned into alleyways of broken concrete. The boarded-off entrance at the end of the last alley on the left had an opening at the bottom where loose boards swing on thick rusted nails. When pushed aside, the boards give way to a tunnel that lead to an area cordoned off by brick walls and condemned buildings. It was here that the forgotten carved out tunnels in the piles of rubbish and erected houses made of old aluminum siding and cardboard boxes. It was here that the homeless have made their homes. 2 sentinels in the form of ancient rusted fire barrels stood at either side of the entrance, guarding the open space beyond. Occasionally the fire from the barrels glinted on something gold peeking from the large mound of shoes that lay just beyond the entrance. Upon further inspection one would note that it's a box, a small hinged jeweled box, a discarded promise from long ago. No one who lived there dared to touch it. They knew better. For the preacher always told them that money was the tool of the demon Greed, and they all knew Greed. He used to sleep with them, play with their children, work beside them. Greed was a constant companion, and when Greed was done with them, he threw them away like so much garbage. The preacher knew that it was Greed that had shut down the factory. Greed had started the fire that had raged with uncontrolled fury. It consumed the factory before moving on to consume the buildings beside it. The blaze destroyed the church while he slept in the back after passing out from a drinking binge. That night the preacher woke to the smell of his own hair burning and searing pain as his flesh sizzled and popped in the heat. He ran from the fire like something from the gates of hell itself. The preacher was alight and screaming like a Roman candle as he ran out and tumbled down the front steps of the church. There he curled up in a pitiful ball and rocked back and forth until the fire went out. When he could finally walk again, he wandered until he found the rest of the forgotten and began to tend to his new flock of lost souls. The preacher thought that he was devout, but he now knew that he wasn't, not really. If he was, he wouldn't be here in purgatory paying for his sins. The homeless he dismissed, the ones he constantly tripped over on his way to the liquor store, they were right when they cursed him and told him that one day he'd be with them, for he was the biggest sinner of them all. And here he was, in purgatory, all the while trying desperately to stay sober enough to pray for their souls every day. Some days the call of his blood was but a whisper. Other days it screamed and begged for a drink. The preacher would have nothing to do with the lust of his blood, for lust led to gluttony, and gluttony was a child of the demon Greed. The preacher knew Greed personally. He had seen the demon just a moment before the fire burned him and took his eyes. The demon wore a black suit and stood leering by the fire alarm. His gold teeth glared in the red light from the exit sign over the door. He watched him unscrew the top of the gas can and walk over to where he lay on the back office floor. Greed poured the gas over the desk and onto his prone body before making a trail out the back. He lit the gas with a match and walked away, laughing. The preacher felt the heat before the pain began. He expected it to go dark before he died, but even after his eyes were gone, he could still see the flames as they consumed him. He wanted to die. However, God had other plans for him. He was found and taken to a hospital and cared for. He survived. It wasn't until after his burns had healed that he remembered that he saw the demon Greed. The preacher thought on it for quite some time before he began discussing it with his new flock. Greed had a weakness, he was sure, but exactly what it was, he didn't know. He realized not long after he started living in purgatory that the only thing worse than greed was famine, for famine lived there too. Famine loved children the most. They were the ones who starved to death the quickest. The preacher wanted to help, but he was too stiff and slow to catch the rats for the young ones to eat. Why were there children in purgatory was something that he begged God to tell him. But so far God had not answered, and famine became a threat that he could no longer ignore. So the preacher had no choice but to start a crusade against the foul demon famine as well. He prayed constantly for an answer. He had to know how to defeat it. Begging for a miracle to come to purgatory, the preacher prayed day after day, but he received no answer. He didn't give up. He refused to let famine win and continued to pray to God for help. After an eternity in purgatory, his miracle came in the form of Wednesday. Wednesday was a tiny black kitten with only one ragged ear. The other was torn off by a dog. Wednesday was a derelict, just like all the other tenants of purgatory, but unlike the others, she never aged a day. According to some, she had been there for over 50 years. How that was possible, the preacher didn't know. He thought it best not to ask. The morning he received his answer from God, Wednesday was on his lap when he awoke. She was mewling and kneading his legs with tiny claws. He knew she was starving. He could hear it in her voice, but there was nothing for him to give her. He didn't even have food for himself. Her misery was more than he could bear. Desperate, the preacher began to pray, truly pray from his heart, for relief from the endless hunger. It was the first honest prayer he had ever said in his life. When he was finished, Wednesday leapt from his lap and began to meow louder. It was as if she were asking him to follow her. After a moment, he stood, and with arms outstretched, he walked slowly towards the kitten's frail voice. She led him straight to the entrance of purgatory, where the flames guarded the exit. The preacher had been told of them, but his fear of fire had prevented him from even wandering this close to the rusted gates. Wednesday didn't want him to go to them, however. She shied away from the fire barrels and leapt atop of the mound of abandoned shoes that loomed by the entrance. She stood there and bid the preacher to come to her with pathetic little mews. Shoes spilled in his wake as he clambered atop the mound until his scarred hands met Wednesday's matted fur. She purred and then jumped away from his grasp. His hands fell down across a smooth metal surface. The preacher sucked in his breath and began to pull on it. It was heavy, almost too heavy for him to lift. After much struggle, he held a brick-sized metal box in his lap. It felt like a lockbox, but it was heavier than it rightfully should be. That, and when he ran his hands over it, his fingers found strange engravings swirling up and down the sides to frame a curious shape, a cornucopia.
"How is this going to feed us?"
the preacher asked. A small whisper drifted to him on the wind. "Listen."
"God?"
"I heard your prayers. They shall soon be answered," the whisper said. "You and your flock shall never go hungry again. Take the box with you. Do not open it. Just place it in the center of the passageway, just 3 steps past the barrels. Come back to it after 1 full day, and in its place shall be a banquet. After you've finished the feast, the box will reappear."
"It will?"
"Yes, but remember, you must never open the box," the whisper said, and died with the wind. His prayers had finally been answered. After all this time, he would now be able to feed his flock. No longer would the children die from hunger in the middle of the night. No longer would he have to hear the wails of despair come from within these walls. The preacher clutched the golden box to his chest as if it were a newborn child, and slowly slid down the shoe mound. With a pounding heart, he shuffled towards the smell and crackle of the fire. His mind screamed at him to run away, that the fire would get him for sure this time. But he would not waver. He would not let his fear stop him from saving his people's lives. He ran shaking hands over the smooth, cold metal surface as he stood there at the entrance, wavering. The voice told him he only had to go 3 steps outside the entrance. Just 3. 3 steps outside of purgatory was not that much of a sin, was it? The preacher shuffled slowly between the fire barrels. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could barely breathe as he felt the warmth of the fire around him. If God didn't want him to leave, then the fire would surely consume him. The preacher took a small step away from the barrels. He stood there and jumped at the sound of spitting flames. He waited for the flames to reach out to him in pillars of searing heat and pain, but they did nothing. He took another small step forward and waited. Nothing happened.
"Just one more,"
the preacher said, and sighed before he resolutely took one more step out into the alleyway. He set the golden box down in front of him before turning around and slowly shuffling back into purgatory. He spent the rest of the day worrying. He prayed that the voice wasn't lying. It would be cruel to promise him food, especially since it had been so long since he had eaten his fill. Shortly after sunset, he drifted off to sleep. The preacher jolted awake by the sounds of a man screaming. It was an awful, gut-wrenching sound, full of pain and unimaginable anguish. The man was begging for someone to save him. His screams cut short, and all was silent. The preacher tried to convince himself that there wasn't anything he could do to help the poor man. He was fragile and weak, and far too slow to be of any use to anyone, let alone someone who was screaming like he was being skinned alive. There wasn't anything he could possibly do. Nothing at all. The next morning, the preacher stiffly rose from his bed and shuffled his way to the passage. He slowed when he felt the heat of the fire barrels. Soon famine's clawed grip on his flock would be finished. All he had to do was go back to the box. The smell of food met him before he could even bend down to pick it up. The preacher painfully bent over and made his scarred body flex. His unsure hands met a warm and neatly arranged meal on a metal platter. The feast consisted of a leg of lamb, baby carrots, fresh warm bread, a small bowl of grapes, and a goblet of red wine. The preacher sat down in the alleyway. He could almost hear the demon famine growl in frustration and anger as he began to eat. When the others smelled the food, they came to him, and the preacher gladly shared his feast with his flock. The unheard of had happened, for a miracle had finally come to the forgotten. The preacher's flock began to sit with him every night, patiently letting him preach while they awaited their morning feast. Famine fled the forgotten's home, for the preacher had found the golden box, their salvation, their cornucopia. When asked about it, all he said was that God had heard his prayers. One of the girls told him that she didn't believe in his God, but it was nice that he gave them food every day. It made him smile. For a time, misery was at a tolerable level for the homeless that lived in purgatory, but that was short-lived, for all happiness is fleeting for the forgotten. In his conquering of famine, the preacher had stopped thinking about the demon greed. He stopped praying to God for salvation against that vicious beast, and let the demon sneak into his flock's dreams, where he whispered to them that they alone deserved the box. No, it didn't take long for greed's venom to poison their hearts and seep into their minds like cancer. It told them that the preacher was a selfish bastard who didn't deserve such a thing. Wasn't he the drunken blind fool who didn't know enough to leave the church when they gave the eviction notice? He should have known. He should have been aware. but he had forgotten. His small victory shone so brightly that it covered the ugly truth that the demon Greed had come back to avenge the death of his brother Famine. The preacher never knew who tried to steal the golden box, or why. He never got the chance to ask. He had fallen asleep with it clutched to his chest and awoke to the sounds of ragged breathing as someone's calloused hands tried to tear the box from his hands. He struggled against them.
You can't have it!
His attacker grunted and wrested the box away from his stiff, scarred hands. The preacher pulled the box away from the greedy man, but he wasn't strong enough to keep it close to him as he rose to stand. The man grabbed hold of the box by the hinged lid and pulled, opening the box.
No!
The preacher fumbled to close the lid, but he couldn't keep it from opening. Whoever it was who had tried to steal the box ran away in terror as a strange sound came from within. It was a sickening, wet slither, like thousands of earthworms in a bucket. An angry burst of wind viciously whipped at the preacher from out of nowhere, and there was something dark and terrifying within it. You opened the box, the whisper said.
I'm sorry. It's not my fault. Someone tried to steal it from me.
You were told not to open the box, not to look inside, but you did. You will be punished for disobedience. You were not meant to see what it is that lies within, and now you must pay.
But I cannot see,
the preacher cried out.
I cannot. Why must I be punished if I cannot even see it?
That matters not. Now you shall pay for unlocking the secrets of your precious miracle. And with that the whisper died away with the wind. The preacher sat in shocked silence as the box shuddered in his hands.
Greed had caused this,
he thought, as the first black tendril wrapped around his chest and sunk a thick, sharp barb into his flesh. It pulled and stripped away his skin as it raised off his body. Tendril after black tendril whipped out of the box and wrapped around him, sinking their barbed ends into his flesh and tearing it off. The preacher screamed until he was hoarse. He begged for God to help him, for anyone to save him, but they did not. The pain was relentless. He was skinned alive, and it was far, far worse than being burned. The preacher said he was sorry, but God did not answer. This was his punishment for ignoring the demon Greed. The preacher felt his limbs pull from their sockets just before a tendril wrapped its coarse barbs around his neck and popped his head off. The tendrils dragged his head along with the rest of him up inside of the golden box as his echoing screams died off. The next morning the preacher was gone, but his flock saw that he had left them a feast as a final farewell. And when they were done eating, they saw the golden box sitting next to the remains of the banquet. No one wanted to believe that this was their last feast, nor did they realize that it was the preacher that they had dined on, and it was his flesh that had tasted so good.